Between the great rivers of the ancient world, the mighty Nile, the swift-flowing Tigris, and the patient Euphrates, a shimmering world once flourished, a world of kings and warriors, of merchants and scribes, of farmers tending sun-drenched fields beneath skies the color of burnished bronze. It was a time before iron, before empires, as we know them, when the first great cities of humankind rose from the earth like islands in a boundless sea of wilderness, from the towering palaces of Egypt to the walled citadels of Anatolia, from the bustling harbors of Byblus and Ugarit to the palace-lined hills of Mycenae and Pylos. A delicate web of kingdoms stretched across the lands now called the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, though distant in miles. These ancient peoples were bound by trade and treaty, by letters pressed into clay and sealed with the marks of kings, by shared beliefs in gods that ruled the skies, the seas, and the earth itself. Copper from Cyprus, tin from the highlands, cedar from Lebanon's misty forests, olive oil, grain, wine, and fine linens flowed from port to port, carried on sturdy ships that traced the coastlines by day and followed familiar stars by night. Messengers, on foot, on horseback, and in swift chariots, delivered news of harvests, of births and deaths, of treaties signed and borders contested. In temples of stone and mud brick, priests offered up fragrant incense, murmuring ancient prayers to Ammon and Baal, to Ishtar and Inanna, to storm gods and sun gods whose names echo faintly even now. It was a world ancient even to the ancients, built upon layers of memory and stone. Beneath the foundations of each new city lay the bones of those that had come before, their stories buried but not forgotten, waiting for the earth to give them up once more. And for a time, this vast network of cities and kingdoms, of farmers and sailors, of kings and slaves, seemed as though it might endure forever. The same sun that warmed the wheat fields of Egypt cast its glow over the olive groves of Crete. The same stars that guided Cypriot ships into distant harbors watched over the harvest. Festivals in Canaan's terraced hills, but all things change. It began subtly, as such things often do. A failed harvest here, a restless border tribe there, rumors carried by weary merchants of unrest in distant lands, strange faces appearing along the coasts, stars that burned a little less brightly in the night sky, and then, as though some ancient hand had swept across the chessboard of kings, cities fell, walls that had stood for centuries crumbled, palaces were abandoned, their painted walls blackened by soot and time, trade routes fell silent, their caravan trails lost to shifting sands and encroaching wilderness. The great Hittite Empire, rulers of Anatolia, vanished almost overnight. Ugarit's harbors fell silent, its clay tablets buried beneath collapsed beams and scorched stone. Even mighty Egypt, though it would endure, staggered beneath invasions, rebellions, and the terrible arrival of mysterious peoples from the sea. And so, within a single generation, across lands that today we call Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt, the first great age of cities, kings, and empires came to a silent, smouldering end. Scholars would call it the Bronze Age collapse, a moment when the lights of civilization dimmed and an age of darkness settled over the Eastern Mediterranean world. Tonight, we travel back to that distant world, to walk the streets of forgotten cities, to witness the rise of kings whose names are half remembered, to stand upon the decks of ships bound for unknown shores. We will trace the great highways of the past, over deserts, through mountain passes, along shimmering coastlines, and glimpse the fragile bonds that once connected 1,000 cities, and a million lives. We will hear the prayers of farmers sowing seed in dusty fields, the hammering of bronze against anvil, the hushed treaties exchanged in torchlit halls, and we will witness the slow unraveling of an age, not with sudden fury, but with the steady, quiet erosion of certainty. For the story of the Bronze Age collapse is not merely the tale of lost cities and fallen kings. It is a story of resilience and renewal, of old ways giving way to new, of memories preserved in stone and clay, in legend and song. And as the night deepens and the stars above wheel silently across the sky, we will remember that even in the quiet collapse of great civilizations, the human spirit endures. Now, close your eyes, breathe deep, and let us begin. Long before the rise of Rome, centuries before the armies of Alexander the Great crossed into Persia, and millennia before the modern borders of nations were drawn upon parchment, there existed a world both ancient and astonishingly sophisticated. This was the late Bronze Age, a time when mighty kings ruled over bustling cities, when vast trade networks stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, and when merchants and sailors carried not only goods, but ideas, languages, and beliefs between distant lands. It was a world alive with movement, with light, with the steady pulse of human ambition and daily labor. From roughly 1550 to 1200 BCE, the lands we now know as Egypt, Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Mesopotamia were home to powerful kingdoms whose influence shaped not just their immediate neighbors, but the entire known world. The pharaohs of Egypt, the warrior kings of the Hittites, the merchants of Ugarit, and the bronze-clad lords of Mycenae, all partook in an interconnected web of diplomacy, trade, and conflict that wove a tapestry more intricate than any woven, clothed up. Though each kingdom possessed its own gods, its own laws, and its own customs, they spoke to one another in languages preserved in clay. The letters of the Amarna archive, discovered in the sands of Egypt, offer glimpses of royal diplomacy, kings addressing one another as brothers, exchanging gifts of lapis lazuli and ivory, requesting brides, and warning of encroaching enemies. These ancient correspondences, pressed carefully into soft clay and baked by time, speak of alliances, betrayals, and the shared recognition that those separated by mountains and seas, these rulers were bound by the same fragile threads of power and necessity. Beyond the courts of kings, ordinary people toiled in fields and workshops, along riverbanks and in stone quarries, beneath the watchful gaze of countless deities. Farmers coaxed barley and emmer wheat from soil made rich by the annual floods. Artisans shaped delicate jewelry from gold and electrum, while others fired clay vessels whose forms reveal as much about daily life as any written text. In the harbors of Tyre and Byblus, sturdy ships bobbed against stone quays, their decks piled high with amphorae of wine, bundles of textiles, and heavy ingots of copper. Sailors navigated by the stars, their knowledge passed from father to son, guiding them safely from island to island along the Aegean coast or across the open waters of the Levantine Sea. In the north, the Hittite Empire stretched across the rugged lands of Anatolia, from their capital at Hattusa, ringed by imposing stone walls and guarded by statues of lions and sphinxes. The Hittite kings commanded armies that could march to the very borders of Egypt. Their archives recorded treaties and military campaigns, festivals and omens, written in the precise, angular characters of cuneiform. To the south, the Egyptians of the New Kingdom stood at the height of their power. Pharaohs such as Amenhotep III and Ramses two built towering temples to Ammon and Ra, their walls adorned with intricate reliefs depicting gods, mortals, and the conquests of the king. Along the banks of the Nile, life followed the eternal rhythm of the river, the planting, the flood, and the harvest, punctuated by grand religious festivals that drew thousands to the temples of Karnak and Luxor, eastward. The cities of Canaan dotted the narrow coastal strip and the inland hills, small though many were. Places like Megiddo, Hazor, and Lachish thrived through trade and local industry. They served as crossroads for goods traveling between the great powers, their markets filled with copper tools, dyed textiles, and precious resins used in both medicine and religious rites. Further still, the city of Ugarit sat upon the northern coast of what is now Syria. A cosmopolitan hub, Ugarit's clay tablets reveal a society that wrote in multiple scripts, conducted international trade, and worshipped a pantheon led by Baal, the storm god. Ships from Cyprus brought copper, while those from Egypt delivered papyrus, glass, and grain. In return, Ugarit exported timber, wine, and skilled artisans whose craftsmanship was prized in foreign courts. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kingdoms flourished. Fortified citadels crowned rocky hills, their stone walls thick and enduring. Within these centers of power, rulers amassed wealth through conquest and trade. Excavations at sites such as Pylos and Mycenae have uncovered storerooms filled with fine pottery, tablets inscribed with inventories and transactions, and tombs packed with gold, death masks, and ceremonial swords. But beyond the riches of kings and palaces, this age was also defined by its fragility. The interconnected nature of the Bronze Age world meant that the fate of one kingdom could ripple outward, affecting distant neighbors. Drought in one region could raise grain prices in another. A rebellion along one border might weaken a dynasty, embolden rivals, or disrupt trade routes vital to the survival of a distant city. Religious beliefs reflected this tenuous balance. Across cultures, gods were believed to control the harvest, the rains, the rivers, and the fortunes of kings. Priests sought to read the will of the divine in the entrails of animals, in the flights of birds, and in the patterns of smoke from temple fires. Festivals and sacrifices were meant to secure favor, to appease wrathful deities, and to maintain the delicate harmony between earth and sky. Archaeologists today uncover the remnants of this world, piecing together its story from broken tablets, shattered statues, and the charred remains of buildings long buried by the passage of centuries. The artifacts tell of a time when no single empire ruled supreme, but rather a collection of powerful, proud, and deeply interconnected kingdoms shared the stage of history. It was a world vibrant with color, with song, with commerce and devotion, and for generations it seemed as though it might endure forever. But nothing in history stands still. Beneath the surface, invisible tensions gathered. Climate shifts, political rivalries, and the quiet rise of restless peoples would soon tip the balance. The ancient highways of trade would fall silent. The letters of kings would cease. Cities that had stood for centuries would burn and crumble. And so, as we drift deeper into the night, let us prepare to trace the signs of this coming storm. The warnings whispered in marketplaces, etched into stone, and left behind in abandoned temples. The unraveling had already begun. Let us follow its subtle beginnings. In the long stretch of human history, the rise of the first kingdoms marks one of our most profound turning points. Before cities, before kings, before armies marching in formation, humankind had lived in scattered villages, clusters of homes made of mud, reed, and stone. These were modest settlements, often hugging riverbanks, sheltered valleys, or forest clearings, where small groups of families farmed, hunted, and fished, their days ruled by the cycle of the seasons and the ancient rhythms of land and sky. But, as the millennia passed, some places began to gather greater significance. A fertile valley, a natural harbor, a reliable water source. These practical necessities drew more people, and with people came opportunity. Villages grew larger, their homes pressed more closely together, and the need for organization increased. Fields had to be tended in unison, water controlled, and disputes settled by trusted elders. Slowly, the simple hierarchy of family gave way to community leadership, and from community to city, and from city to kingdom. In the lands we now call Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, this transformation unfolded in its own time, shaped by the unique features of each landscape. Along the Nile, the predictability of the river's annual flood allowed for careful planning, the sowing and reaping of crops upon which thousands could depend. This bounty made it possible for some to specialize in trades beyond farming as stonecutters, scribes, weavers, and merchants. With specialization came surplus wealth, and with wealth came power. The early cities of Mesopotamia, clustered between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, offer some of the earliest examples of this progression. Places like Uruk and Ur grew from farming settlements into bustling urban centers, their streets lined with homes and workshops, their horizons dominated by towering temple platforms known as ziggurats. These cities gathered surrounding lands into their orbit, controlling trade routes, demanding tribute, and exerting influence over neighboring communities. As the centuries unfolded, powerful families and ambitious leaders began to consolidate authority. Some claimed descent from the gods, while others relied on military strength or strategic marriages to expand their reach. At first, their power might have been confined to a single city and the fertile fields beyond its walls. But over time, as trade brought new wealth and competition sparked conflict, the strongest leaders extended their rule over multiple towns and villages. These early rulers soon faced challenges unknown to their tribal ancestors: how to defend newly conquered lands, how to administer justice to distant provinces, how to maintain loyalty among restless populations. In response, the institutions of early kingship evolved. Councils of elders gave way to royal courts, and personal rule transformed into dynastic power. Temples, once modest shrines to local deities, grew into monumental complexes where the divine and political merged in Egypt. This process of consolidation reached extraordinary heights. By around 3100 BCE, the legendary figure of Nama, or Menes, is believed to have united the lands of Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. Along the fertile ribbon of the Nile, a string of towns and cities bent to the authority of a single ruler, whose title pharaoh embodied both human kingship and divine stewardship. The pyramids that still rise above the desert sands were not only tombs, but symbols of royal control over labor, resources, and belief itself. In Anatolia, highland settlements slowly coalesced into larger polities. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, the Hittites had forged a kingdom that spanned mountains, plateaus, and valleys, centered at Hattusa. Their kings were warriors, priests, and judges, their authority recognized in treaties and in stone carvings that lined the gates of their cities. Further south, in the Levant and along the eastern Mediterranean coast, city-states arose, each with its own ruler, council, and temple. Though smaller than their Egyptian and Mesopotamian counterparts, These cities, such as Byblus, Sidon, and Ugarit, commanded strategic harbors and fertile hinterlands, their leaders wielding power through control of trade and alliances with greater empires. In the Aegean, Mycenaean Greece followed a similar path. Hilltop fortresses grew into palace-centered citadels, their thick stone walls enclosing storerooms, workshops, and royal quarters. Here to kings combined martial prowess with religious authority, presiding over societies that valued both strength in battle and the favor of capricious gods. Though the details varied from region to region, a pattern emerges. The rise of kingdoms was not sudden but gradual, an organic response to the pressures and opportunities of a changing world. Increased population demanded new systems of organization. The accumulation of wealth created competition and conflict. The challenges of defense and administration led to the centralization of power and always. The enduring belief that rulers were somehow set apart, chosen by the gods, blessed by omens, or born of sacred lineage, lent a legitimacy to these early kingships. Power was both practical and symbolic, exercised through laws and armies, but also through religious festivals, monumental architecture, and rituals that affirmed the ruler's place at the center of both the earthly and cosmic order. In this way, the first kingdoms of the Bronze Age rose from scattered settlements to enduring states, their rulers overseeing lands stitched together by necessity, ambition, and belief. Their stories, inscribed upon tablets and carved into stone, remind us that the desire to organize, to lead, and to leave a legacy is among the oldest of human instincts. As the kingdoms of the Bronze Age flourished, their survival and prosperity increasingly depended upon their relationships with one another. No kingdom, no matter how fertile its lands or how skilled its craftsmen, could truly thrive in isolation. Resources were unevenly scattered across the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. Copper was abundant in Cyprus and the mountains of Anatolia, while tin, essential for making bronze, was far rarer and arrived through long, uncertain routes from distant highlands and unknown western lands. Timber, so vital for building ships and palaces, was prized from the dense forests of Lebanon. Lapis lazuli came from the far-off mountains of Afghanistan, and so trade became the lifeblood of this interconnected world. Great caravans of donkeys wound their way across desert trails, carrying bales of cloth, pots of fragrant oil, jars of honey, and lumps of precious metal. Along riverbanks and across open seas, sturdy ships with square sails traced familiar routes between harbors like Byblus, Ugarit, and Mycenae, their holds heavy with amphorae of wine, oil, and grain. This trade was not merely the exchange of goods. It carried ideas, languages, and beliefs. A merchant ship setting sail from the ports of Canaan might return with Egyptian amulets, Cypriot copper, and stories of distant lands. Diplomatic marriages between royal houses wove fragile bonds of loyalty and obligation. Treaties inscribed in cuneiform or hieroglyphs promised peace and mutual defense. In the palaces of Hattusa, Thebes, and Mycenae, scribes recorded the arrival of foreign embassies, their gifts, and the messages they carried. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets discovered in Egypt, reveal a world where kings addressed one another as equals, styling themselves brother and exchanging tokens of goodwill. Pharaohs requested horses from Anatolian kings, while rulers of small city-states begged Egypt for military aid against neighboring foes. The tone of these letters ranges from warm and deferential to sharp and demanding, reflecting the complexities of status, pride, and power. Trade treaties and diplomatic exchanges were reinforced by religious ritual. In many cultures, It was believed that oaths sworn in the name of the gods carried sacred weight, and the violation of such oaths risked divine wrath. In Hittite treaties, for example, a long list of deities, both native and foreign, were invoked as witnesses, and elaborate curses promised calamity to any ruler who broke the agreement. Beyond the royal courts, religion infused every aspect of daily life. The people of the Bronze Age lived in a world where natural forces were animated by divine will. The sun and moon were not merely celestial bodies, but gods that observed human affairs. Storms, floods, and drought were seen as signs of favor or anger from the heavens. Each city, each kingdom, maintained its own temples and priesthoods, devoted to a pantheon of deities whose names and attributes sometimes shifted across regions, but whose roles remained constant. In Mesopotamia, temples rose at the heart of every major city, ziggurats of sun-baked brick upon which priests offered sacrifices and consulted omens. In Egypt, vast temple complexes like Karnak and Luxor housed statues of Amun-Ra and Isis, their inner sanctuaries reserved for the pharaoh and high priests alone. The rituals of these temples sought to maintain a delicate balance between the mortal and divine. Daily offerings of bread, beer, incense, and meat were laid before the gods' images. Festivals marked the cycles of harvest and flood, the turning of the seasons, and the anniversaries of kings' ascensions. Processions wound through city streets, carrying sacred statues beneath canopies, accompanied by music, chanting, and the scent of burning resin. Religious practices also shaped diplomacy. Royal marriages between kingdoms were often accompanied by the exchange of religious objects, amulets, carved statues, and sacred texts, reinforcing the idea that peace between peoples was sanctioned by their gods. Envoys might stop to make offerings at temples en route to foreign courts, seeking divine favor for their missions. Trade, too, had its sacred aspects. Merchants prayed for safe passage before embarking on voyages across uncertain seas, leaving votive offerings at shrines along the shore. Contracts and transactions were sometimes witnessed in the presence of a local deity, whose temple served as both a religious and administrative center. At times, religious beliefs themselves traveled along with goods and people. Deities from one region found new homes in foreign lands. The storm god Baal of Canaan, for example, was worshipped as Hadad in Mesopotamia and Tarhuns in Anatolia. The fertility goddess Astarte crossed seas and kingdoms, her symbols recognized by traders and sailors in every port. This blending of gods and rituals reflected a world both deeply rooted in tradition and surprisingly open to new influences. Kingdoms might war against one another, but they shared a belief in the sacred, in the power of ritual to bind, to heal, and to legitimize rule. And so, trade, diplomacy, and religious practice wove together the fragile fabric of the Bronze Age. A single grain shipment delayed by storm, a failed diplomatic mission, or a neglected temple ritual could ripple across this interconnected world in ways unseen but deeply felt. It was a world of alliances, both sacred and strategic, of commerce guided by both profit and piety, a world where, for a time, humanity achieved a remarkable balance between ambition and reverence. Yet, even as these bonds strengthened, the pressures upon them mounted. Like unseen fissures beneath the foundations of great cities, the rising storm would soon test the resilience of these ancient ties. Much of what we know about the world of the late Bronze Age comes not from grand monuments or weathered statues, but from small, unassuming objects left buried for millennia, tablets of clay, pressed with tiny, wedge-shaped marks, dried in the sun or fired in the heat of ancient kitchens and palace storerooms. These simple relics, scattered across ruined cities and long-abandoned archives, preserve the voices of kings, merchants, priests, and scribes. Among the most revealing of these treasures are the collections known as the Amarna letters and the Archive of Ugrit. Together, they offer a window into a vanished world, where the business of diplomacy, trade, and daily life was recorded in meticulous, steady lines of cuneiform. In the sands of central Egypt, near the ancient city of Akhetaten, the city built by Pharaoh Akhenaten as a new capital devoted to his god Aten, a cache of clay tablets lay undisturbed for over 3,000 years, discovered by local villagers in the late 19th century, and later excavated by archaeologists. These Amarna letters number close to 400, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day. The tablets contain correspondence between the Egyptian court and other great powers of the region, the Hittites of Anatolia, the Mitanni of northern Mesopotamia, the Karsites of Babylon, and the petty kings of Canaanite cities along the eastern Mediterranean coast. What they reveal is a world both highly structured and deeply personal. Kings addressed one another as brother, acknowledging their shared status, while lesser rulers styled themselves as your servant, eager to secure Egypt's favor. The letters speak of marriages proposed and disputes over dowries. They record requests for gold, fine textiles, and horses. They relay warnings of rebellion and the movements of nomadic raiders. One letter, sent from a king of Alasia, the ancient name for Cyprus, gently chides the Egyptian court for suspecting him of disloyalty, while another from the king of Byblus pleads desperately for military assistance as enemies gather at his gates. These tablets preserve not the grand proclamations of victory or conquest, but the everyday concerns of rulers navigating a complex, unstable world. Even more evocative is the archive uncovered at Ugrit, a port city along the northern coast of what is now Syria. For centuries, Ugrit prospered as a hub of trade, its harbors welcoming ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and the lands of the Aegean. Its scribes recorded contracts, royal decrees, religious hymns, and diplomatic letters, their clay tablets neatly stacked in palace storerooms and temple libraries. When archaeologists excavated the site in the early 20th century, they unearthed thousands of tablets, written not only in Akkadian but also in Ugaritic, a cuneiform script representing a local, Semitic language. It was here that scholars first encountered complete mythological texts describing the gods of the Canaanite pantheon: Baal, the storm god; El, the father of the gods; and Anot, the fierce goddess of war and fertility. These myths, so carefully preserved in baked clay, echo the religious beliefs and cosmologies of the wider Bronze Age world. They tell of battles between gods and the forces of chaos, of seasons and cycles, of life, death, and renewal, reflecting the profound relationship ancient peoples felt with the natural and divine forces that shaped their lives. But alongside these sacred stories, Ugarit's tablets also document the workings of trade and diplomacy. Letters describe shipments of copper and grain, agreements between kings, and the movements of envoys and merchant vessels. One tablet notes a merchant's request for safe passage through foreign waters, while another records a treaty between Ugarit's ruler and a Hittite king, pledging mutual assistance in times of war. Most poignant of all, perhaps, are the final letters found in the city's last days, as invaders closed in. Likely the enigmatic sea peoples, desperate missives were dispatched to neighboring allies, begging for aid. The charred remains of these final tablets, discovered in collapsed archives, bear witness to a world on the brink of collapse. The voices of scribes silenced by fire and sword. These archaeological finds offer more than simple facts. They bring texture and humanity to ancient history. Through them, we hear the concerns of kings, the fears of commoners, and the prayers of priests. They remind us that even in distant ages, people struggled with uncertainty, sought reassurance from their gods, and reached out across borders in search of friendship and stability. And so, as we drift deeper into the story of the Bronze Age, these tablets remain as gentle whispers from the past, scattered fragments of a lost conversation, still speaking after 3,000 years. As the kingdoms of the Bronze Age flourished, an intricate and delicate web of connections spread across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. It was a network of trade routes, diplomatic ties, shared religious traditions, and cultural exchange, a world far more interconnected than one might expect of an age so distant from our own. At the heart of this ancient world system were the great powers, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Babylonia, and the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece. But their influence extended well beyond their borders, weaving together smaller city-states and regional powers like Ugarit, Byblos, and Cyprus, and linking them to even more distant lands, across arid deserts, along fertile river valleys, and upon the wind-dark seas. Ships and caravans carried goods, ideas, and people from one kingdom to another. A merchant in the bustling port of Ugarit might encounter Egyptian scarabs, Mycenaean pottery, and Cypriot copper in the same marketplace. An envoy sent from the Hittite court to Egypt might stop at way stations built generations earlier, where local rulers paid homage to the great empires that loomed beyond their horizons. Messages, gifts, and marriage alliances passed between kings and queens, their contents carefully recorded on clay tablets and sent with trusted couriers. The exchange was not limited to material goods or political agreements. Religious beliefs flowed along these same routes. Deities crossed borders, assuming new names and attributes as they traveled. The storm god revered in Anatolia was worshipped as Baal in Canaan and Tarhuns among the Hittites. Fertility goddesses, such as Ishtar, Astarte, and Anat, appeared in temples across the region, their myths echoing familiar cycles of death and renewal. Stories, too, made their way from one culture to another. Tales of great floods, heroic battles, and capricious gods surfaced in different tongues, carried by sailors, traders, and wandering storytellers. Inscriptions and myths discovered at Ugarit, for example, bear striking similarities to later biblical narratives and Mesopotamian epics, hinting at a long, unbroken chain of storytelling that spanned centuries and civilizations. Even styles of architecture, pottery, and metalwork reflected this interwoven world. Mycenaean palaces displayed Minoan frescoes, while Egyptian jewelry incorporated materials from lands hundreds of miles away. The tools of agriculture, warfare, and ceremony were shaped not by isolation, but by steady, constant influence from neighboring lands. This interconnectedness had practical consequences as well. When one region suffered drought or conflict, the effects rippled outward. A famine in Anatolia might delay copper shipments to Egypt, while a war between city-states could disrupt trade routes vital to the economies of distant kingdoms. The tablets from Amarna and Ugarit reveal a world keenly aware of its interdependence, a recognition that stability in one region often relied upon the strength and goodwill of others, and yet, for all its complexity, this network was fragile, bound together by mutual need, by pacts and promises, and by the tenuous belief in order. It was vulnerable to the forces of nature and human ambition. The same trade routes that brought prosperity could just as easily carry armies. Alliances, built through diplomacy, could unravel in a generation. A failed harvest, a wandering tribe, or a restless general might upset the careful balance upon which this connected world rested. Still, for several centuries, the kingdoms of the Bronze Age achieved something remarkable. Across vast distances and diverse cultures, they forged a system of interaction that allowed wealth, knowledge, and belief to flow freely. It was, in many ways, the first great international age, a distant ancestor to the global networks of our own time. And as we move forward in our story, it is important to remember how closely these kingdoms were bound to one another. For when one thread frayed, the entire tapestry would begin to unravel. For centuries, the great kingdoms of the Bronze Age seemed to flourish in a state of uneasy harmony. While conflicts flared and alliances shifted, the system of trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence held firm. The seas were busy with ships, the roads thick with caravans, and the temples filled with offerings to gods who, it seemed, continued to favor their worshippers. But even in these years of prosperity, faint tremors hinted at gathering trouble. The signs, though subtle at first, began to multiply, signs that the fragile balance between nature and civilization was beginning to strain. One of the earliest and most dangerous threats came not from the ambitions of kings or the schemes of neighboring powers, but from the sky itself. Across the eastern Mediterranean, records and paleoclimatic studies suggest that drought began to grip the land. The reliable cycles of rain, so essential for sustaining crops, became erratic. Inscriptions from Egypt's New Kingdom mentioned years of poor harvest, while sediment cores from ancient lake beds in Syria and Israel reveal layers of dry, dusty soil where once fertile lands had thrived. A prolonged drought could mean disaster in a world so dependent on agriculture. Cities, whose populations swelled in times of plenty, quickly faced shortages when the rains failed. Fields once heavy with wheat and barley lay cracked and barren under a relentless sun. Famine bred discontent, and the once thriving markets of cities like Ugarit and Mycenae struggled to fill their stalls. Alongside this slow, insidious crisis of climate, another force stirred beneath the earth. The region that gave rise to the Bronze Age civilizations sat along active fault lines, and evidence suggests that a series of powerful earthquakes struck the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Archaeological layers in cities such as Troy, Ugarit, and Hattusa show signs of sudden collapse, fallen walls, shattered temples, and abandoned streets. The destruction was not uniform, but where it struck, it left cities vulnerable to further disasters. A toppled granary meant starvation. A cracked palace wall left a ruler exposed to rivals. Temples reduced to rubble seemed ominous, as if the gods themselves had turned their faces away. Natural disasters rarely act alone. In the Bronze Age, a drought or earthquake could set into motion a chain of misfortunes that quickly spiraled beyond control. Scarce resources led to disputes over water rights and harvest shares. Refugees from ruined towns sought shelter elsewhere, straining the resources of neighboring communities. In the countryside, bandits and displaced peoples formed restless bands, preying upon weakened cities and isolated villages. It was during this same period that unsettling reports began to spread of strangers arriving by land and sea. Egyptian records carved into stone and painted upon temple walls speak of invasions by mysterious groups referred to collectively as the Sea Peoples. Their precise origins remain unknown, though many theories suggest they were a mixture of displaced tribes, mercenaries, and raiders driven by famine, warfare, and climate disruption in their own homelands. The pharaoh Meneptah and later Ramses III recorded battles against these invaders, describing fleets of ships appearing along Egypt's shores, their warriors armed with round shields, spears, and distinctive feathered headdresses. The temple reliefs at Medinet Habu, built during Ramses III's reign, depict these desperate struggles in careful detail, chariots clashing, archers loosing volleys of arrows, and foreign ships engulfed in flame. Yet these invasions were not limited to Egypt alone. Archaeological evidence shows that cities across the Levant and Aegean fell in quick succession. The once bustling port of Ugarit was destroyed and left in ruins. The storied palaces of Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns were abandoned or burned. In Anatolia, the mighty Hittite capital of Hattusa was reduced to rubble. The speed and scale of this destruction point not only to coordinated invasions but to an underlying vulnerability. The kingdoms of the Bronze Age, for all their splendor, had become deeply reliant upon a system of trade and diplomacy that now faltered under the combined pressures of natural disaster and human conflict. A drought that forced hungry peoples from their homelands, combined with cities weakened by earthquakes, created opportunities for invasions that might have been repelled in earlier, stronger years. And with trade routes severed, access to vital resources, copper, tin, grain, and timber, was suddenly cut off. These combined hardships caused cities to turn inward, hoarding their supplies and fortifying their walls. Once open harbors became defensive outposts. Caravans ceased their journeys across the dusty roads of Canaan and Anatolia. The religious festivals and diplomatic exchanges that had bound these kingdoms together gave way to suspicion and isolation. Even within the palaces, tensions mounted. Rulers faced restive populations, angered by hunger and fearful of foreign attack. Elite families, once allied by marriage and treaty, turned against one another in desperate bids for survival. The careful order of the Bronze Age world, maintained for centuries by custom, diplomacy, and shared belief, was beginning to unravel, and so, as drought gripped the fields, earthquakes shook the cities, and unknown invaders appeared upon the horizon. The warning signs multiplied. The interconnected web that held together the kingdoms of the Bronze Age strained and frayed, one fragile thread at a time. Soon, these isolated events would gather into a storm from which no kingdom could escape. As the stability of the Bronze Age world began to falter under the weight of drought, earthquakes, and foreign incursions, the official records of the time quietly began to reflect a growing unease. These were not dramatic proclamations of doom, but steady, almost routine notations of rebellions, betrayals, and disturbances that became increasingly common, preserved in cuneiform letters and stone carvings. These records offer us glimpses of a world growing restless, the early echoes of collapse in the great halls of Hattusa, capital of the Hittite Empire. Scribes diligently recorded the affairs of state on clay tablets. Many of these documents were meant for internal communication. Reports from governors, military commanders, and officials in distant provinces. The tone of these letters, especially in the empire's final decades, reveals a world in which authority was being tested. Messages speak of rebellious vassals refusing tribute, border regions under threat, and cities turning against their overlords. A particularly telling letter comes from a Hittite official stationed in the city of Ugarit, who warns of foreign ships sighted off the coast and local unrest brewing within the city's walls. The words are cautious, measured, but unmistakably anxious. Elsewhere in Anatolia, governors requested reinforcements against raiding bands and asked for instructions on dealing with rebellious towns. The correspondences suggest that the imperial center was stretched thin, resources scarce, and loyalty increasingly conditional. These small acts of defiance, which might once have been easily suppressed, now carried greater weight in an empire straining to hold itself together. Further south, in Egypt, a different kind of record chronicled the unfolding troubles. The Egyptians had long maintained detailed relief carvings on the walls of their temples, images meant to proclaim divine kingship, military victories, and the triumph of order over chaos. Yet these very depictions, often created to celebrate Egypt's strength, now reveal how deeply unrest had spread at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III. A long series of reliefs depict battles against invading forces. Rows of chariots and ships clash with warriors wielding spears and axes. The faces of the invaders are unfamiliar, men wearing feathered headdresses, horned helmets, and checkered tunics. Ramses is shown standing firm, drawing his bow against these enemies of the realm. While the imagery is meant to celebrate his victories, it also confirms that Egypt, too, was under siege. Hieroglyphic inscriptions alongside these images provide further details. Ramses speaks of how the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands, and how they came like locusts across the sea. The account describes invasions by peoples whose names are only partially preserved: the Shwedan, the Shekelesh, the Luka, and others, collectively known as the Sea Peoples. These records are significant not only for their content, but for what they reveal about Egypt's changing priorities. Resources that might once have been devoted to temple building, trade expeditions, or monumental projects were now directed toward defense. Coastal fortresses were strengthened, new garrisons established, and Egypt's navy mobilized. Even within Egypt's borders, the signs of strain were clear. Administrative papyri from this era, though rare, hint at food shortages, labor strikes, and disputes over land and taxation. In one notable incident, recorded during the reign of Ramesses III, tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, the artisans who built the royal tombs, staged what is considered history's first recorded labor strike, protesting the late delivery of their food rations. Meanwhile, in the Levantine city-states, under Egyptian influence, unrest grew steadily. The Amarna letters, though slightly earlier, already revealed a pattern of local rulers appealing to the pharaoh for assistance against rebellious neighbors and nomadic raiders known as the Habiru. These scattered groups, often marginalized and landless, became increasingly bold as central authority weakened in later decades. As Egypt's new kingdom power waned, these small-scale conflicts escalated. Entire towns fell into the hands of rebels or foreign invaders. Tribute ceased to arrive in the capital. Regional governors found themselves isolated, their garrisons too small to repel organized attacks. What these letters, reliefs, and inscriptions collectively reveal is a pattern of growing instability, a breakdown not of one empire, but of an interconnected system. Rebellion in one region threatened trade and diplomacy in another. A city's fall sent refugees streaming into neighboring territories, further straining their resources and patience. Yet the records also show how slowly the ruling elites responded to these threats. Imperial courts, perhaps accustomed to centuries of stability, clung to old strategies, dispatching envoys, negotiating marriages, sending small military expeditions. Few seemed to grasp the scale of the danger, until the tide of invasions and collapse was well underway. The ancient scribes could not have known they were recording the final decades of a world order. Their letters and carvings were meant to maintain the appearance of control, to reassure rulers and gods alike. And yet, in the quiet admissions of rebellion and unrest, we hear the unmistakable rustle of history beginning to turn, as the kingdoms of the Bronze Age weathered the rising storms of drought, earthquake, and invasion. A quieter, more persistent movement unfolded across the lands. The ancient world began to shift, not just in palaces and battlefields, but along dusty roads, mountain passes, and coastal harbors. This was the age of migration, slow at first, then gathering pace, as families, tribes, and entire communities uprooted themselves in search of food, safety, and a new home. Evidence of these migrations comes not from grand inscriptions or proclamations of kings, but from scattered clues left in the soil. Archaeologists have uncovered settlements abandoned in haste, hearths cold and empty, and grain stores left untouched. In other places, new villages appeared almost overnight. Modest clusters of homes built from stone and mud brick in regions once uninhabited or sparsely populated. These movements were driven by necessity. Prolonged drought left fields fallow and pastures dry. The old certainties of seasonal rains and harvests no longer held. Herds dwindled, wells ran low, and once wealthy cities, dependent upon the fertile countryside for food and labor, could no longer feed their people. The countryside emptied, and those without land or status found themselves forced to wander. The upheaval of war compounded these hardships, as invaders descended upon cities along the Levantian coast and Anatolian highlands. Surviving inhabitants fled to safer regions. Some sought refuge within the walls of neighboring towns, swelling their populations beyond sustainable limits. Others struck out across the land or set sail upon the sea, risking unknown dangers for the promise of a new beginning. These migrating groups included not only displaced villagers and farmers, but also entire tribes and seafaring peoples. The ancient Egyptians, in their temple inscriptions, speak of the sea peoples arriving in waves, bringing their families, animals, and possessions with them. They were not merely raiders, but entire migrant communities seeking fertile land and better fortunes. Economic records from this period, though fragmentary, hint at a world economy buckling under the strain. The once steady flow of copper from Cyprus, essential for the production of bronze, became irregular. Tin, rarer still, and sourced from distant lands, grew scarce. Without these critical materials, the tools of farming, construction, and warfare deteriorated. Markets that once bustled with merchants bearing foreign wares fell silent. The trade routes that had crisscrossed the eastern Mediterranean, connecting Egypt to the Aegean and the Levant to Mesopotamia, began to fray and close. Caravans grew fewer and more vulnerable to attack. Ports, once gateways to distant lands, transformed into fortified enclaves wary of foreign ships. In this climate of uncertainty, local economies turned inward. Communities that had long depended on imported luxuries and exotic goods returned to subsistence living. Pottery styles became simpler, reflecting diminished trade and resources. Writing, once used to record commercial transactions and royal decrees, vanished from many regions altogether. The collapse of international trade meant more than the loss of wealth. It disrupted the entire fabric of daily life. Temples found themselves without the means to acquire incense from Arabia or precious stones from distant mines. Artisans lost access to materials like ivory and faience. Even the simple matter of clothing became difficult as the networks that once brought fine textiles unraveled. As resources dwindled, tensions within communities worsened. Social hierarchies, once enforced by wealth and prestige, began to crumble. The gap between rulers and commoners narrowed, not through reform, but through shared hardship. Inscriptions from later periods reflect a world where famine, rebellion, and uncertainty became commonplace. For those on the move, the experience of migration was one of hardship and vulnerability. Groups traveling overland faced dangers from bandits, hostile settlements, and the relentless demands of survival. At sea, small vessels braved unpredictable waters, clinging to coasts and seeking sympathetic harbors. Yet amidst the dislocation, some communities adapted. New settlements emerged in defensible locations on hillsides, near reliable water sources, or along less traveled routes. These villages often lacked the monumental architecture of earlier cities, reflecting a more modest, pragmatic approach to survival. Some scholars believe that these migrations contributed to the eventual rise of new ethnic and cultural identities. The early Israelites, for example, may have emerged from a mixture of displaced Canaanite populations and nomadic tribes settling in the central highlands of Canaan during this period. Similar patterns likely played out across Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Levant, though largely invisible in grand royal records. These migrations reshaped the demographic and political landscape of the ancient world. They laid the groundwork for new communities, new languages, and new beliefs that would take root in the aftermath of empire. By the end of the 12th century BCE, the once cohesive web of Bronze Age civilizations had given way to a patchwork of isolated settlements and fledgling polities. The interconnected world of merchants, kings, and diplomats had been replaced by villagers clinging to hillsides, wary of strangers, and dreaming of the old world they had lost. In time, these new communities would build again. But for now, the migrations and economic collapse marked a long twilight for the civilizations of the Bronze Age, a slow, grinding end to a world once bound together by trade, diplomacy, and shared prosperity. As the physical world of the Bronze Age faltered under the combined weight of drought, invasions, and economic disruption, another quieter unraveling took place, one within the hearts and beliefs of its people. In an age where the favor of the gods was thought to govern everything from harvests to victories in battle, the persistent troubles of this era must have felt like a divine abandonment. And while the grand temples and priestly rituals continued, the stories people told, the myths they passed down, and the inscriptions they carved in stone began to reflect a deeper, more unsettled spirit. We catch glimpses of these anxieties in the surviving myths of the region, many of which seem to mirror the chaos unfolding in the world around them. In ancient Mesopotamia, tales like the Epic of Gilgamesh, though older, took on renewed significance during times of trouble. The story of a great flood sent by the gods to cleanse a corrupt world must have felt hauntingly familiar to those facing natural disasters and social collapse. The theme of divine punishment for human failings was a recurring motif, one that offered both explanation and warning. In Canaan and the Levant, religious texts and myths spoke of battles between order and chaos, between storm gods like Baal and the monstrous forces of the sea and underworld. Baal's battles with Yam, the personification of the chaotic ocean, were not merely metaphors but reflections of a world that often teetered on the brink of disorder. In times of environmental stress and social unrest, these ancient stories gained a new and ominous relevance. Egyptian inscriptions, known for their confident proclamations of pharaonic power, also reveal subtle signs of unease. The records of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, while celebrating military victories over foreign invaders, depict scenes of desperation, refugees arriving with their families and livestock, entire towns in flight, and the unsettling specter of the Sea Peoples threatening the divine order of Egypt itself. Reliefs show temples fortified like fortresses, and the inscriptions speak of the pharaoh not just as a ruler, but as a protector against chaos incarnate. The cosmic battle between Mat, the principle of harmony and order, and Isfet, the force of disorder, seemed to bleed from the spiritual realm into everyday reality. The enemies of Egypt were not merely men but embodiments of cosmic imbalance. In Anatolia, inscriptions from the waning years of the Hittite Empire mention repeated omens, eclipses, unusual animal births, and failed harvests, interpreted as signs of divine displeasure. Priests and diviners attempted to decipher the will of the gods, offering sacrifices and adjusting rituals to appease angry deities. Yet despite their efforts, the troubles persisted. Even within the ruins of Ugarit, tablets inscribed in cuneiform reflect a desperate world. Letters plead for aid, warn of approaching enemies, and record anxious prayers for deliverance. One text, a ritual tablet, contains instructions for invoking the protection of the gods against invading enemies and plague, a reminder that in times of great uncertainty, people turned to their traditions, seeking solace in familiar rites. But perhaps the most enduring reflection of this age's spiritual anxiety comes not from official inscriptions or temple walls, but from the myths that would later form the foundation of cultural memory. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, traditions of a lost golden age, a time of peace and prosperity before calamity, emerged and were passed down through generations. The story of Troy, immortalized centuries later in Homer's Iliad, hints at this. While told as a heroic epic, its underlying sorrow speaks to a world where great cities could fall and old certainties vanish. Other legends of wandering peoples, lost kingdoms, and cities swallowed by the earth preserve the echo of these troubled times. In this way, myths and religious traditions served not only as explanations for disaster, but as a means of preserving collective memory. They offered both comfort and caution, reminding listeners of the fragility of civilization and the unpredictable will of the gods. As the Bronze Age drew toward its long twilight, these stories and inscriptions reveal a society wrestling not only with physical threats, but with profound spiritual questions. Why had the gods, who once brought abundance and victory, now allowed suffering and ruin? Had humanity broken sacred laws, or was it the gods themselves who had turned away? Such anxieties, quietly inscribed in clay, painted on temple walls, and whispered round hearth fires, would endure long after the palaces and cities crumbled. They left a legacy of cautionary tales and sacred texts that would shape the beliefs and fears of the generations that followed. As the late Bronze Age world stumbled toward its long, unsettling twilight, a new and enigmatic force entered the historical record. These were the peoples the ancient Egyptians would later call the Sea Peoples, a name born not from a single tribe or nation, but from the uncertainty that surrounded them. Their identity remains one of history's most enduring mysteries. Their sudden appearance in the annals of ancient kingdoms, leaving behind questions that have yet to be fully resolved. Our earliest accounts of the Sea Peoples come from the carved walls and inscriptions of Egyptian temples. The pharaoh Meneptah, who reigned around 1213 to 1203 BCE, was among the first to record their presence. In his famous victory, Stele, Meneptah recounts campaigns against Libyan tribes and foreign invaders described as coming from the sea, though brief. These mentions hint at the scale of the problem, a multi-tribal confederation attacking by land and sea, capable of threatening Egypt's western borders. But it was during the reign of Ramses III, several decades later, that the Sea Peoples would leave their clearest mark upon the historical record. At his mortuary temple of Medinet Habu, detailed relief carvings and hieroglyphic inscriptions tell of a massive invasion around 1177 BCE, when Egypt, already strained by internal challenges, faced waves of foreign warriors arriving by both ship and land caravan. The inscriptions describe these invaders as coming from the islands and include named groups: the Dan, Shekelesh, Denian, Lucca, and Peliset. These names appear alongside depictions of distinctive warriors wearing horned helmets, feathered headdresses, and carrying round shields and longswords. They arrive not merely as raiders, but with their families, livestock, and belongings, suggesting a mass migration rather than a simple military campaign. Ramses III's inscriptions provide a vivid, though self-congratulatory account of the confrontation. According to the records, Egyptian forces engaged these invaders in fierce naval and land battles. Carvings show tightly packed ships in chaotic combat, with archers loosing arrows from shore, while enemy ships collide in the river's narrow waters. Ultimately, Ramses claimed victory, crediting the gods for Egypt's deliverance. Though Egyptian accounts are understandably one-sided, they remain among the best preserved contemporary sources about the Sea Peoples. Complementing these are fragmentary records from other Bronze Age cities, whose correspondence and tablets hint at growing pressure from seaborne aggressors. At the coastal city of Ugarit, now modern-day Ras Shamra in Syria, unearthed cuneiform letters paint a scene of rising desperation. One letter from a local official to a neighboring ruler pleads for military aid, warning of enemy ships already offshore. Not long after, Ugarit would be destroyed, its walls reduced to rubble, its temples left abandoned. The Hittite Empire, centered in what is now Turkey, also felt the weight of these incursions. Though the precise cause of the empire's fall remains debated, evidence suggests that invasions by foreign forces contributed to the empire's destabilization. Records from Hittite vassal states mention growing disorder, and archaeological layers show signs of widespread destruction in cities along the Anatolian coast, even far to the west. In the Aegean, the legendary city of Troy met its fate around this time, while later epic poetry would immortalize Troy's fall in tales of Helen and Achilles. Archaeological evidence from Troy via a settlement layer dated to the late 13th or early 12th century BCE, reveals evidence of violent destruction and hurried abandonment. Scholars have long debated the origins of these enigmatic sea peoples. Were they displaced tribes fleeing environmental collapse, mercenary groups turned marauders, climate refugees seeking fertile new lands? Some suggest that they hailed from the Aegean islands, others from western Anatolia, and still others from as far afield as Sicily or the Balkans. The names recorded by Egyptian scribes offer possible clues. The Danaan might be connected to the Danaans of Homeric legend, while the Pelesit are often associated with the Philistines, who would later settle in southern Canaan. What is certain is that these sea peoples represented a highly mobile, aggressive, and organized force. Their arrival coincided with, and perhaps accelerated, the widespread collapse of palace economies, international trade networks, and long-established power structures. Within a span of decades, many of the great city-states and empires of the Bronze Age crumbled or vanished, their written languages forgotten, their trade routes severed. The Egyptian records stand as the last, defiant voice of the Old World. After Ramses III's victories, the Sea Peoples seemed to settle in the southern Levant and coastal regions of Canaan. Later biblical and Assyrian records would mention groups resembling those named in Egyptian inscriptions, suggesting that these once nomadic or displaced peoples gradually integrated into the patchwork of post-collapse societies. In modern times, archaeological discoveries have added to our understanding, though many questions remain. Pottery styles, weapon designs, and burial practices hint at cultural connections between the Sea Peoples and regions around the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. Yet without their own written records, the Sea Peoples remain a people glimpsed through the eyes of their enemies and the ruins they left behind. And so, they persist as one of history's unresolved enigmas. Neither wholly myth nor fully understood, the Sea Peoples symbolize the disquiet of a collapsing world, a mobile force moving in the shadows of falling empires, forever recorded in stone by those who survived them. Among the most detailed and evocative records of the Sea Peoples' incursions come from the inscriptions and relief carvings of Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramses III, Egypt's last great warrior pharaoh. In an era when the Bronze Age world was unraveling, Ramses III sought to immortalize his victories over these formidable foes in stone. The Medinet Habu reliefs stretch across temple walls, their intricate images capturing chaotic scenes of battle. The accompanying hieroglyphic texts describe how Egypt faced a confederation of foreign tribes advancing from both land and sea. These were not mere raiding parties but massive groups moving with their entire populations, men, women, children, and livestock, in tow. According to the inscriptions, the Sea Peoples had already laid waste to other territories before arriving at Egypt's doorstep. The records mention lands laid low as if they had never existed, a chilling testament to the devastation left in their wake. Ramses III, in these inscriptions, positions himself as the divine protector of Egypt, standing firm against the tide of chaos. The naval battle scenes are among the most striking. Carvings depict Egyptian ships facing enemy vessels in close quarters, with archers loosing arrows from the decks and from shore. The Sea Peoples' distinctive ships, long, open vessels adorned with prows shaped like bird heads, are shown, colliding in violent clashes. Warriors wield spears and swords, while bodies tumble into the river's currents. On land, the reliefs show Egyptian infantry clashing with Sea Peoples' warriors, identified by their unique helmets, feathered crests, and round shields. Prisoners are paraded before the pharaoh, their arms bound, while piles of severed hands, a grim record of fallen enemies, attest to the scale of the conflict. The inscriptions credit Egypt's gods, particularly Amun and Ra, with granting Ramses the strength and wisdom to repel the invaders. Ritual offerings and ceremonies are described as preceding the battles, reinforcing the notion that these were not merely military campaigns but cosmic struggles between order and chaos. Though the inscriptions claim a resounding Egyptian victory, modern scholars debate the long-term consequences. While Egypt may have turned back the Sea Peoples, the strain on the kingdom was evident. Resources were depleted, border territories weakened, and Egypt's ability to project power abroad diminished. It marked one of the final times Egypt would repel a large-scale invasion before entering a prolonged period of decline. Nevertheless, Ramses III's victory at Medinet Habu became a defining moment in Egyptian memory. For centuries afterward, it was cited as a testament to pharaonic might and divine favor. The reliefs and texts, carefully preserved within the temple's walls, ensured that the story of Egypt's defiance against the Sea Peoples would endure long after both victors and vanquished had vanished from the stage of history. For centuries, the enigma of the Sea Peoples has invited speculation from scholars, archaeologists, and historians alike. With no definitive records from the Sea Peoples themselves, their identity, origins, and motives remain elusive. What can be pieced together comes from fragmentary inscriptions, scattered artifacts, and later myths. Yet, through these whispers of history, several theories have emerged, each offering a possible window into the nature of this restless, nomadic confederation that so profoundly shaped the final years of the Bronze Age. One of the most widely discussed theories suggests that the Sea Peoples were displaced tribes, uprooted from their homelands by a cascade of environmental disasters and social unrest. The Late Bronze Age was a period marked by significant upheaval, evidence of prolonged droughts, crop failures, and declining harvests appears in both written records and sedimentary data taken from ancient lakebeds and coastal regions. When agricultural economies faltered, entire communities may have been forced to abandon their lands in search of more hospitable territories. This displacement theory aligns with accounts from Egyptian and Near Eastern sources, which frequently describe the Sea Peoples as arriving not just as soldiers, but with their families, livestock, and belongings. Such descriptions evoke images of refugee caravans, driven by necessity and seeking new lands to settle. If true, this mass migration would have placed enormous pressure on the established city-states and kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, contributing to the wider instability that characterized the period. Closely related to this is the hypothesis of climate refugees. Modern paleoenvironmental studies, examining pollen records, ice cores, and soil deposits, suggest that a significant climatic shift occurred around 1200 BCE. This so-called Late Bronze Age crisis may have brought prolonged drought and unusually cold conditions to regions dependent on consistent harvest cycles. Water sources, dried pasturelands, withered, and famine loomed. Faced with these challenges, seafaring groups from the Aegean, Anatolia, or the Western Mediterranean may have been compelled to migrate en masse. These climate refugees, desperate to escape environmental collapse, might have transformed from peaceful settlers into hostile invaders as they clashed with established powers, already stretched thin by their own crises. The sudden, widespread destruction of numerous Bronze Age cities, from Ugarit to Hattusa, could reflect the desperate struggle between the Old World's defenders and these displaced peoples. Another prominent theory frames the Sea Peoples as professional warriors or mercenary bands, perhaps originating from the fringes of the Aegean and Western Anatolia. In this view, they were not a unified nation but a confederation of opportunistic raiders and soldiers for hire, whose services were no longer in demand as the palace economies that once employed them collapsed. Left without patrons or purpose, these warriors might have turned to piracy and plunder, forming temporary alliances to attack wealthy coastal cities and trade routes. Support for this theory comes from Egyptian inscriptions that describe the Sea Peoples as organized and well-armed, with distinctive weaponry, shields, and tactics. Their ships, depicted in the Medinet Habu reliefs, were large, fast, and designed for open sea navigation. suggesting an established maritime tradition. Such characteristics imply a degree of military discipline and operational coordination unusual for mere refugees. It's also possible that the Sea Peoples represented a combination of these factors. Groups displaced by famine or drought may have joined forces with mercenaries, unemployed soldiers, and raiders, forming mobile coalitions united by necessity rather than shared ethnicity or culture. Their loose confederation could have operated with a single purpose: survival through conquest and settlement. This fusion theory helps explain the diversity of names recorded in Egyptian inscriptions, such as the Shurdan, Shekelesh, and Peleset, which may have referred to different peoples working in alliance. Some of these names, like the Peleset, are later associated with settled communities, such as the Philistines of Canaan, suggesting that while some groups were destroyed or dispersed, others successfully integrated into the new post-collapse societies. Another intriguing proposition ties the Sea Peoples to political upheavals within the Mycenaean Greek world. The destruction of palatial centers like Mycenae, Pyrrhons, and Pylos occurred around the same period as the Sea Peoples' appearance in Egyptian records. Could exiled or dispossessed Greek factions, driven from their homes by civil war or dynastic struggles, have taken to the sea in search of new territories? While direct evidence remains sparse, some scholars point to similarities in pottery styles, burial customs, and weapon designs between Mycenaean Greece and the archaeological remains found in later Philistine settlements. Such links hint at a possible Aegean connection in the broader Sea Peoples phenomenon. In truth, it is likely that no single theory can fully account for the Sea Peoples' origins or motivations. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age was a complex, interconnected event marked by climate change, economic decline, political instability, and mass migrations. In this volatile environment, numerous displaced, dispossessed, and disillusioned groups may have banded together out of shared desperation, transforming themselves into one of the most disruptive forces the ancient world had ever known. What remains clear is the profound impact the Sea Peoples had on their world. Their incursions helped dismantle some of the mightiest empires of the time and reshaped the Eastern Mediterranean's political and cultural landscape. Their story, still largely shrouded in mystery, continues to capture the imagination, a reminder of how human societies, ancient and modern, are shaped by the unpredictable forces of nature, conflict, and migration. In the closing years of the Late Bronze Age, a wave of destruction swept across the Eastern Mediterranean, leaving once prosperous cities in ruin. Among the most famous of these were Ugarit, Troy, and Hattusa, each a vital center of culture, trade, and diplomacy in its time. Their sudden and violent ends have long captivated historians and archaeologists, who seek to understand how entire civilizations could vanish so swiftly. The city of Ugarit, located along the coast of modern-day Syria, was a bustling hub of commerce and diplomacy. Its strategic position allowed it to serve as a vital port, connecting Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean world. Ugarit's royal archives, discovered in the 20th century, revealed a city deeply engaged in international affairs. Clay tablets written in cuneiform recorded trade agreements, political treaties, and religious practices, offering a rare glimpse into the interconnected nature of the Late Bronze Age. But around 1190 BCE, Ugarit fell silent. Archaeological evidence shows the city was violently destroyed, its walls breached, buildings burned, and streets left littered with debris. Excavations uncovered hoards of precious goods hastily hidden, suggesting the attack came swiftly and without warning. Among the most poignant finds is a clay tablet, still unfired, left in a kiln as the city was overwhelmed, a final, unfinished record from a world on the brink. The exact cause of Ugarit's destruction remains debated. Contemporary letters found in the city plead for assistance against an impending attack by sea-borne raiders, widely believed to be the Sea Peoples. The desperate messages never reached their destinations. By the time help might have arrived, Ugarit was lost, its once vibrant port abandoned to the encroaching sands. To the northwest, on the coast of Anatolia, the legendary city of Troy met a similarly tragic fate, immortalized in Homer's epic poems. Troy was a real city with a history far older than the stories of Helen and the Trojan horse. Archaeological work at the site of Hisarlik has uncovered multiple layers of occupation, with Troy via dating to the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, showing clear signs of violent destruction. The remains of Troy via reveal hastily built defensive walls, evidence of food shortages, and a layer of ash and rubble consistent with a siege or attack. Human remains discovered in the debris suggest deaths by violence, while storage jars left uncollected point to a sudden abandonment. Although the precise cause of Troy's fall is uncertain, many scholars connect it to the same wave of invasions and unrest that affected the entire region. Whether attacked by Sea Peoples, rival Anatolian factions, or Aegean raiders, Troy's end reflects the wider instability of its time. Further inland, the collapse of the Hittite Empire brought the destruction of its capital city, Hattusa. Nestled in the central highlands of modern Turkey, Hattusa was a marvel of Bronze Age engineering, a walled city of imposing fortifications, palaces, and temples. It served as the administrative and religious heart of the Hittite realm, controlling a vast network of vassal states and trade routes. Around 1200 BCE, Hattusa was abandoned and partially destroyed. Archaeological surveys have revealed burned buildings, toppled walls, and scattered weapons. Written records within the city abruptly cease, and the royal archives, once filled with treaties and annals, fell silent, while the exact circumstances of Hattusa's fall remain uncertain. It likely involved both external assault and internal dissent, compounded by famine, resource shortages, and political fragmentation. In the aftermath of these destructions, the Eastern Mediterranean entered a darkened age. International trade networks collapsed, literacy rates plummeted, and large-scale political organization gave way to smaller, isolated communities. The memory of these fallen cities lingered in oral traditions, shaping the myths and legends that would echo for generations. Modern excavations continue to uncover evidence of this period's violence and upheaval. At Ugarit, Troy, and Hattusa, layers of ash, collapsed buildings, and abandoned treasures testify to the suddenness and severity of the collapse. Though each city fell for its own reasons, some likely besieged by invaders, others brought down by internal strife or natural disaster, together they mark the closing chapter of the Bronze Age's great urban centers. These ruins, now silent under centuries of earth and stone, remind us of the fragility of complex societies and the unpredictable forces, both human and natural, that can bring them down. The Sea Peoples, whether raiders, refugees, or desperate migrants, played a role in this era of upheaval, yet so too did droughts, earthquakes, famines, and the relentless pressures of changing climates and shifting alliances. In the shattered remains of Ugarit's palace, the crumbled walls of Troy, and the empty streets of Hattusa, the ghosts of the Bronze Age speak to us still a cautionary tale of civilization's resilience and its vulnerabilities. The interconnected world that had once thrived along the shores of the eastern Mediterranean was gone, replaced by a quieter, more isolated age. Yet the stories and lessons of these ancient cities endure, carried forward in legend, inscription, and the stones left behind. The Hittite Empire once stood as a towering power in the ancient Near East, its influence stretching across vast swaths of Anatolia and beyond. For centuries, the Hittites maintained a complex network of cities, vassal states, and alliances, marked by a sophisticated administration, flourishing culture, and military strength. Yet, as the Bronze Age drew to a close, even this mighty empire could not withstand the tides of change that swept across the region. At the heart of the Hittite realm was Hattusa, the imperial capital nestled among the rocky hills of central Anatolia. The city was a marvel of its time, with massive stone walls, royal palaces adorned with intricate reliefs, and temples dedicated to a pantheon of gods. For generations, the Hittite kings ruled from Hattusa, negotiating with foreign powers, waging wars, and presiding over ceremonies that affirmed their divine authority. That the strength of the Hittite Empire rested not only on its military might but also on its ability to manage a diverse and often fractious collection of territories. Through treaties and marriages, tribute and diplomacy, the empire held together a patchwork of kingdoms, cities, and peoples, each with their own customs and rulers. The Hittite kings skillfully balanced these relationships, maintaining peace and order for much of the late Bronze Age. But by around 1200 BCE, this delicate balance began to unravel. The first signs of trouble appeared in the form of external pressures, groups of raiders and migrants, perhaps including the enigmatic Sea Peoples, pushed at the borders of Hittite lands. These incursions strained the empire's military resources and disrupted the flow of goods and communication. Within Hattusa itself, cracks appeared. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a great fire that swept through the city, destroying parts of the palace and administrative buildings. The timing of this conflagration coincides with the wider collapse sweeping through the eastern Mediterranean. It is unclear whether this fire was the result of an attack, internal rebellion, or accident, but its effect was devastating. Moreover, political fragmentation plagued the empire. Local governors, once loyal vassals, grew increasingly independent. The central authority of the Hittite king weakened as rival factions vied for power. This internal strife made it difficult to coordinate defense or respond effectively to external threats. Environmental factors also played a role in the empire's decline. Recent studies suggest that prolonged drought and agricultural shortfalls may have caused food shortages, undermining the economic base that supported the elite and the army. Famine would have heightened tensions within the population, sparking unrest and weakening social cohesion. The Hittite script, cuneiform tablets, recording treaties, royal decrees, and religious texts, abruptly ceases around this time, suggesting a rapid collapse in the bureaucratic systems that had kept the empire running. Without administration, taxation, and law enforcement, the empire's infrastructure could no longer function. As Hattusa was abandoned, many of the empire's satellite cities suffered similar fates. Archaeological layers reveal destruction by fire, abandonment, or gradual decline. The once unified realm fractured into smaller, isolated communities, losing the political and economic integration that had defined it. The fall of the Hittite Empire sent shockwaves across the region. Neighboring powers, such as Egypt and the Mycenaean kingdoms, found themselves facing new threats and shifting alliances. Trade routes once protected and maintained by the Hittites became unsafe or closed, further isolating cities and reducing prosperity in the centuries that followed. The memory of the Hittite Empire faded, surviving primarily in the records of other civilizations. Yet, the ruins of Hattusa stand today as a silent testament to a civilization that once shaped the course of history. A reminder of how even the greatest powers can succumb to the complex interplay of war, environment, and human ambition. The New Kingdom of Egypt was once the most powerful and prosperous civilization in the ancient world. From its grand temples and palaces to its sprawling empire that extended deep into the Levant and Nubia, Egypt was a beacon of stability and culture throughout the Late Bronze Age. Yet, even this seemingly invincible kingdom could not escape the tides of change that swept across the eastern Mediterranean, ushering in a time of uncertainty and decline. The New Kingdom reached its height during the 18th and 19th dynasties, with pharaohs such as Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Ramses II wielding unmatched military and political power. Egypt's armies pushed far beyond its borders, controlling key trade routes and securing valuable resources. The splendor of this era is still evident in the colossal temples of Karnak and Luxor, and the monumental tombs carved into the Valley of the Kings. However, by the late 13th century BCE, signs of weakening began to appear. One of the earliest indications came in the form of increasing pressure from external groups, particularly the Sea Peoples, whose raids along the Mediterranean coasts challenged Egypt's naval and territorial dominance. Pharaohs were forced to divert resources to defend these vulnerable frontiers, straining the kingdom's military and economic capacity. The reign of Ramses III, often considered the last great warrior pharaoh, was marked by intense conflict with these invaders. His famous mortuary temple at Medinet Habu contains vivid reliefs depicting massive sea battles, with Egyptian forces confronting fleets of hostile ships. These inscriptions show Egyptian archers, charioteers, and infantry repelling assaults, a desperate struggle to maintain control. Despite these efforts, Egypt's hold on its empire began to slip. The loss of overseas territories meant reduced access to vital raw materials, such as timber, metals, and luxury goods, which had supported the kingdom's economy and craft industries. Trade routes that once flourished fell into disarray, weakening commercial networks that linked Egypt to Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Internally, the New Kingdom faced political instability. Successive pharaohs contended with court intrigues, rival factions, and religious upheavals. The reign of Akhenaten, earlier in the 14th century BCE, had introduced dramatic changes in religious practice, promoting the worship of a single sun god, Aten, and disrupting traditional priesthoods. Though later rulers restored the old pantheon, the social fabric remained strained. Economic difficulties compounded these problems. Records from the period indicate shortages of food and supplies, possibly linked to poor harvests and environmental stress. Tomb inscriptions and papyri describe labor strikes by artisans and workers at the royal necropolises, a rare glimpse into the frustrations of the common people. As the 12th century BCE progressed, Egypt's centralized control weakened. Regional governors and local rulers gained more autonomy, sometimes acting independently of the pharaoh's authority. This decentralization eroded the efficiency of administration and military command, making coordinated responses to threats more difficult. The once mighty Egyptian army, famed for its discipline and equipment, became less effective. Recruitment struggles and declining resources meant fewer soldiers, and fortifications along the Nile Delta and the Levantine coast suffered neglect. The loss of key cities and fortresses reduced Egypt's ability to project power and protect its borders. In addition to human conflicts, environmental factors played a role in Egypt's decline. Evidence suggests periods of drought and famine, which would have strained agriculture and population stability. Changes in Nile flooding patterns could have disrupted the vital irrigation systems, further imperiling food production. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egypt was a shadow of its former self. The once expansive empire had shrunk, its influence confined primarily to the Nile Valley. The pharaoh's authority was contested, and rival factions vied for power in a time of growing uncertainty. Yet, even amid decline, Egyptian culture endured. Temples continued to be built and maintained. Religious practices adapted to new circumstances, and the arts flourished in more localized contexts. The resilience of this civilization allowed it to survive through subsequent centuries of foreign invasions and political fragmentation. The weakening of Egypt's New Kingdom stands as a poignant chapter in the story of the Bronze Age collapse. It reminds us that even the greatest empires, with all their wealth and power, are vulnerable to the combined forces of external threats, internal discord, and environmental challenges. The story of Egypt's struggles during this time echoes through its monuments and writings, inviting reflection on the fragile balance that sustains civilizations. The Mycenaean civilization, flourishing from around 1600 to 1100 BCE, was a dominant power in the Aegean during the Late Bronze Age. Known for its impressive palatial centers, rich burial sites, and complex society, the Mycenaeans left behind a legacy of monumental architecture and vibrant art that echoes through history. Yet, as the Bronze Age collapse unfolded, the grand palaces that once symbolized their strength and order were gradually abandoned, marking the end of an era. At the heart of the Mycenaean world were palatial complexes such as Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes. These centers served as administrative hubs, overseeing agricultural production, craft industries, and trade. The palaces were fortified with massive cyclopean walls, grand megarons, great halls, and storerooms filled with goods. The palatial elite ruled with a blend of military power and religious authority, maintaining order through a network of officials and scribes. The palaces were not only political centers but also cultural ones. They housed workshops where artisans created intricate pottery, finely wrought weapons, and gold jewelry. The Mycenaeans developed a writing system known as Linear B, used primarily for record-keeping and administration. These clay tablets, found in various palaces, reveal a highly organized society with detailed accounts of goods, personnel, and religious offerings. However, beginning around 1200 BCE, this orderly world began to unravel. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction and abandonment of many Mycenaean palaces. The exact causes remain debated, but it is clear that a combination of internal unrest, external invasions, and broader regional turmoil played a role. Excavations at sites like Pylos reveal signs of violent destruction, with burned layers and collapsed walls suggesting attacks or widespread fires. At other sites, such as Mycenae and Tiryns, the decline appears more gradual, with evidence of reduced occupation and diminished administrative activity before final abandonment. The collapse of the palatial system had profound consequences. Without the central authority of the palace, local communities became more isolated. The sophisticated bureaucratic structures that managed resources and labor disappeared, leading to a more fragmented and less hierarchical society. The loss of Linear B writing after the fall of the palaces marks a significant cultural shift. For centuries, the Mycenaeans had maintained detailed records in their script. But this literacy vanished in the subsequent Dark Ages. This loss of written language limited communication and the preservation of knowledge, contributing to a period often characterized by fewer monumental constructions and simpler material culture. The reasons behind the abandonment of the Mycenaean palaces are likely multifaceted. Some scholars suggest that internal social upheaval, perhaps rebellion by disenfranchised groups or struggles among the elite, weakened the palatial centers from within. Others point to external pressures, including raids or invasions by sea, peoples or other migrating groups, disrupting trade and security. Environmental factors may also have contributed. Changes in climate, such as drought or soil exhaustion, could have reduced agricultural productivity, making it harder to support large urban populations and palace economies. Earthquakes, common in the region, might have caused structural damage, hastening decline. Trade disruptions across the Mediterranean further isolated the Mycenaean centers, as maritime networks faltered due to broader regional instability. Access to essential raw materials and luxury goods diminished. This economic contraction would have strained palatial authority and resources. Despite the turmoil, the legacy of the Mycenaean palaces endured. Their architectural achievements influenced later Greek culture, and some aspects of their religious practices survived in new forms. However, the abandonment of the palaces marked the end of the Bronze Age palace culture and the beginning of a quieter, more rural period in Greek history. This transformation set the stage for the eventual rise of the classical Greek civilization centuries later. The Mycenaean palaces, once bustling centers of power and culture, became silent ruins, a poignant reminder of the fragility of even the mightiest human achievements. The Bronze Age collapse was not only marked by the fall of great empires and cities, but also by a profound breakdown in the complex networks that connected these civilizations. Trade routes that once crisscrossed the eastern Mediterranean and Near East became disrupted or vanished altogether. Alongside this economic upheaval came a significant decline in literacy and record-keeping, marking a retreat from the bureaucratic sophistication that had characterized the preceding centuries. 4 centuries before the collapse, the late Bronze Age world thrived on interconnection. Goods, ideas, and people moved along well-established maritime and overland trade routes, linking kingdoms such as Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Ugarit, and the city-states of Mesopotamia. Exotic materials like tin, vital for making bronze, traveled great distances. Luxury items, ivory, gold, precious stones traded hands regularly, fueling wealth and cultural exchange. Trade was more than just economic. It was a foundation for diplomacy and peace. Treaties often included provisions for the safe passage of merchants and envoys. Diplomatic letters between rulers, many preserved on clay tablets, reveal a world where commerce and politics were inseparably linked. However, as the Bronze Age waned, this intricate web began to unravel. The widespread destruction of key ports, palaces, and production centers disrupted supply lines. Archaeological evidence shows a marked decline in imported goods at many sites, suggesting that once vibrant trade networks had largely ceased. The loss of trade routes had ripple effects. Without access to essential materials, local economies struggled. For example, tin scarce in the Near East and crucial for making bronze became difficult to obtain. This shortage hampered the production of tools and weapons, impacting agriculture, warfare, and craft production. In many regions, the breakdown of long-distance trade coincided with the rise of smaller, more self-sufficient communities. These groups relied increasingly on local resources, leading to simpler economies and material cultures. This shift is reflected in the archaeological record, where fewer luxury items and standardized goods are found. Alongside the economic decline, literacy also suffered a serious setback. The Late Bronze Age had seen the flourishing of writing. Systems such as cuneiform in Mesopotamia and Anatolia, and Linear B in Mycenaean Greece. These scripts were tools of administration, diplomacy, religion, and culture. Yet, following the collapse, many of these writing systems disappeared. The abrupt end of palace economies and bureaucratic centers meant fewer scribes and less demand for written records. In Greece, the use of Linear B ceased entirely, ushering in what is often called the Greek Dark Age, a period with scant written evidence. Similarly, in other regions, fewer texts have been found from the centuries following the collapse. The decline in literacy meant that knowledge, laws, and traditions increasingly relied on oral transmission rather than written documents. This shift had profound implications for the continuity and development of civilizations. The loss of literacy also meant the disappearance of many administrative and diplomatic records. Without written treaties or economic accounts, reconstructing the details of this turbulent era becomes challenging for historians. What survives often comes from neighboring cultures or later periods. Despite this decline, some traditions persisted or adapted. For example, in Egypt, hieroglyphic and hieratic writing continued, though on a reduced scale. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform was still used but faced challenges as cities and empires diminished. The decline of trade and literacy thus symbolizes a broader retreat from the interconnected and bureaucratic world of the Late Bronze Age. It reflects how the collapse was not only about the destruction of cities or loss of political power, but also about the breakdown of the systems that sustained complex societies. Yet, in the darkness that followed, seeds for future renewal were planted. Oral traditions kept alive stories, histories, and cultural identities. Later, civilizations would rediscover and revive writing and trade, building upon the remnants of their ancestors. The decline in trade and literacy, while a sign of loss and fragmentation, was also a transformation. It marked a pause in human complexity, a moment when survival became more localized, and when the pathways of knowledge and exchange were closed, at least for a time. As the great cities and palaces of the Bronze Age crumbled, the world around them quietly transformed. The collapse of large empires and the breakdown of expansive trade networks led to a profound reshaping of human society. Where once vast kingdoms had thrived with their bustling urban centers, a new pattern emerged. People began living in smaller, more isolated communities. These new settlements were often rural, situated away from the former centers of power and commerce. Without the protection and infrastructure of mighty palaces and fortified cities, many people sought safety in the familiarity of their local environment. Villages became the primary units of social life, relying on local resources and tight-knit relationships. The scale of human interaction shrank. Communities focused inward, centering around subsistence, farming, simple crafts, and mutual aid. The complex administrative systems that had coordinated large populations and economies faded away. Instead, leadership was often informal and communal, rooted in family ties or respected elders rather than distant monarchs or centralized bureaucracies. This shift to smaller settlements was not merely a retreat, but also a necessary adaptation. The instability and violence that marked the period made large urban centers difficult to sustain. Smaller groups could better manage limited resources, avoid the attention of raiders, and maintain social cohesion amid uncertain times. Archaeological evidence supports this picture. Many previously flourishing cities show signs of destruction or abandonment, while smaller villages continued or even appeared anew. Material culture from this period often reflects simpler lifestyles, modest pottery, fewer imported goods, and more basic tools. Though isolated, these communities were far from static. They became the seeds of future civilizations, preserving cultural practices and adapting traditions to new realities. The slower pace of life, away from the complexities of empire, allowed for a different kind of social rhythm, one intimately connected to the land and seasons. In this quieter world, human resilience shone through. People found ways to rebuild their lives, maintain their identities, and nurture hope for the future. The shift to smaller, isolated communities was a chapter of transformation, where survival and adaptation paved the way for renewal. The Bronze Age was a time when long-distance trade connected distant lands, weaving a network of exchange that linked peoples and cultures across the Mediterranean and Near East. Ships sailed vast seas, caravans crossed deserts, and goods like tin, copper, precious stones, and luxury items moved steadily between kingdoms. But as the Bronze Age collapse took hold, these vital trade routes began to falter and eventually disappear. The destruction of key ports, cities, and administrative centers cut the arteries that sustained economic and cultural exchange. Once busy harbors fell silent, and merchant ships became rarer on the waves. Without the security provided by strong empires, trading became perilous. Raiders and migrating peoples disrupted safe passage, while the collapse of centralized authority meant fewer agreements and protections for merchants. The steady flow of goods dried up, leaving communities isolated and deprived of materials crucial for everyday life and craftsmanship. The loss of these trade routes had wide-reaching effects. Regions once prosperous from commerce faced shortages, especially of essential resources like timber, critical ingredient in bronze making, which was not locally abundant in many areas. As trade declined, economies contracted, and local production replaced imported luxury and raw materials. This breakdown also slowed the spread of ideas and technology. The cultural vibrancy that had flourished through exchange diminished, as isolated communities had less contact with their neighbors. In many ways, the collapse of trade routes marked a turning point from a connected world to one of fragmentation and regionalism, though the trade networks would eventually be rebuilt in later centuries. This period of silence represented a pause in human connectivity, a quiet moment before new paths and new civilizations emerged. As the Bronze Age world transformed, so too did the spiritual and social fabric of its peoples. The collapse of large empires and the retreat to smaller communities brought deep shifts in religion and social organization. Ancient practices adapted, sometimes quietly evolving, other times breaking in new directions altogether. Religious life during the height of the Bronze Age was often centered around grand temples, powerful priesthoods, and elaborate rituals tied closely to the palatial states. Fertility deities, storm gods, and celestial figures symbolized the forces of nature that governed survival, rain, harvest, war, and family continuity. The temples served as places not only of worship but also of economic and political influence. When the palaces fell silent and cities emptied, these religious centers lost their prominence. Without the centralized power to maintain large-scale temple complexes or priestly hierarchies, religious practices became more localized. Smaller communities worshipped in humble shrines, open-air altars, or sacred natural sites like groves and springs. This period saw a shift from state-controlled cults to more personal and communal forms of worship. Deities once tied to royal power now became guardians of family, clan, or village well-being. Rituals simplified, focusing on practical concerns, protection, fertility, health, reflecting the immediate needs of people facing uncertain times. Social structures also changed in tandem. The hierarchical order sustained by kings, nobles, and scribes gave way to more egalitarian or kin-based leadership. Authority often rested with elders, councils, or charismatic individuals who could persuade rather than command. The loss of bureaucratic systems meant governance became less formal and more flexible. These shifts in religion and social structure are visible in the archaeological record. Artifacts suggest the decline of elaborate temple art and inscriptions, replaced by simpler symbolic objects and domestic altars. Texts from the period where they survive hint at new mythologies and religious ideas that would later influence emerging cultures. Ultimately, these changes laid the foundation for future religious traditions. The movement from palace cults to community worship, and from rigid hierarchies to kinship bonds, echoed through later history, resonating in the myths, rituals, and social patterns of the Iron Age and beyond. In the quiet aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, as written records dwindled and great cities faded, human memory found new ways to endure. With literacy and centralized archives diminished, stories, histories, and cultural knowledge passed from mouth to ear, weaving the fabric of oral tradition. These spoken tales became the guardians of the past. Through generations, communities recounted events, heroes, and divine encounters, not as precise chronicles, but as living stories shaped by memory and meaning. The hardships of collapse, the glory of former times, and the hopes for renewal were all preserved in song, poetry, and ritual. Oral traditions offered more than mere recollections. They became frameworks for understanding suffering and survival, blending history with myth to make sense of a changed world. Heroes from fallen kingdoms were remembered not only for their deeds, but as symbols of identity and resilience. Many of these stories later formed the foundation for written epics and sacred texts. Elements of Bronze Age memories appear echoed in the myths of the Iron Age, in tales like the Iliad and Odyssey, or in religious narratives that shaped new faiths. The collapse's trauma was transformed into lessons, warnings, and hope. In this way, oral tradition served as a bridge the broken past with an uncertain future. It kept alive the spirit of communities scattered across a fractured landscape, nurturing a shared heritage even when walls, palaces, and archives lay in ruins. As listeners drift to sleep, these whispers of ancient voices remind us that even in darkness, stories enduring the light of human experience from one age to the next. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's most intriguing puzzles. Modern scholars have devoted decades to exploring the many forces that may have combined to bring down once thriving civilizations. Rather than a single cause, today's consensus leans toward a complex web of interconnected factors, each contributing to a gradual unraveling. One major theory centers on environmental changes, particularly prolonged droughts. Paleoclimate studies, analyzing ice cores and sediment layers, suggest that large parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced significant dry spells during the Late Bronze Age. Reduced rainfall would have strained agricultural production, leading to food shortages and social unrest. Crops failed, rivers shrank, and pastoral nomads faced increasing pressures to move in search of resources. Alongside drought, earthquakes have been proposed as a disruptive force. The region sits on several active fault lines, and archaeological evidence shows layers of destruction consistent with seismic events in some ancient cities. Earthquakes could have toppled walls, ruined infrastructure, and destabilized communities already weakened by environmental stress, invasions, and migrations. Especially those linked to the mysterious sea peoples form another critical piece of the puzzle. Contemporary inscriptions from Egypt describe intense battles with seafaring groups disrupting coastal cities. These movements of peoples may have been partly triggered by environmental hardship, pushing tribes into conflict with established kingdoms. Economic factors also played a significant role. The Bronze Age world was an intricate network of trade routes and political alliances. When one part of the system faltered, ripple effects were felt far and wide. Disrupted commerce meant shortages of essential materials like tin and copper, vital for bronze tools and weapons. The loss of trade and tribute destabilized economies, undermining the power of elites who depended on wealth flow. All these elements feed into the broader idea of a system's collapse. This theory views the Bronze Age civilizations as complex, interdependent systems vulnerable to cascading failures. When environmental stress, social unrest, invasions, and economic breakdowns converged, the system could no longer sustain itself. The collapse was not sudden, but a slow, multifaceted decline, culminating in the abandonment of cities and political fragmentation. Modern research appreciates that these factors did not act in isolation, but combined in unpredictable ways. The interplay of natural disasters, human agency, and economic vulnerability created a perfect storm that reshaped the ancient world. This evolving understanding encourages us to think of the Bronze Age collapse less as a dramatic catastrophe and more as a transformative period, a turning point where old structures faded and new societies slowly emerged. Archaeology offers us a tangible connection to the past, a window into the lives, struggles, and transformations of Bronze Age societies. The physical remains uncovered by excavations have played a crucial role in testing and refining the theories about the Bronze Age collapse, shedding light on the complex events that reshaped the ancient world. One of the most striking pieces of evidence comes from the destruction layers found at many key sites across the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeologists have uncovered charred ruins, collapsed walls, and abandoned buildings dating to the late Bronze Age. These layers of destruction suggest widespread violence and sudden upheaval. Cities like Hattusa and Mycenae bear the marks of catastrophic events that left them empty or significantly altered. These destruction layers support the theory of invasions or attacks, possibly by the enigmatic sea peoples or other migrating groups. Egyptian inscriptions, for example, describe fierce battles and coastal raids, and the archaeological record confirms sudden and widespread devastation in regions that had previously flourished. Fortifications were built or strengthened in response, only to be overwhelmed or abandoned. At the same time, evidence of natural disasters is apparent in some sites. Earthquake damage, such as collapsed walls without signs of fire, has been identified in cities like Troy and Hazor. This supports the idea that seismic activity may have compounded human conflicts, further destabilizing societies already under stress. Paleoclimatic data also aligns well with archaeological findings. Studies of pollen, sediment, and isotopes from lake beds and caves reveal patterns of prolonged drought during this period. The decline in agricultural productivity is echoed by a decrease in food storage facilities and shifts in settlement patterns from large urban centers to smaller, dispersed villages. These changes indicate the challenges communities faced in sustaining large populations under harsher environmental conditions. Trade networks, once robust and far-reaching, show signs of disruption. Archaeologists have noted a reduction in imported luxury goods, such as finely crafted pottery and metalwork, in many sites after the collapse. This suggests that long-distance commerce had broken down, likely due to the combined effects of war, political fragmentation, and economic strain. Written records, where available, add another layer of evidence. Tablets from sites like Ugarit and the Amarna letters reveal growing tensions, pleas for assistance, and reports of raids and famine. These documents hint at internal unrest, weakening alliances, and the pressures mounting on these kingdoms. Yet not all evidence points to abrupt destruction. Some sites show gradual decline, with reduced building activity and population shrinkage over decades. This supports the system's collapse theory, emphasizing a slow unraveling fueled by multiple stressors rather than a single catastrophic event. In sum, the archaeological record is rich and multifaceted, confirming that the Bronze Age collapse was a complex process. It was shaped by the violence of invasions, the fury of natural disasters, the strain of environmental change, and the breakdown of economic systems. Each piece of evidence brings us closer to understanding how ancient societies confronted and endured one of history's greatest transformations. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is far from complete. As archaeology advances and new technologies emerge, our understanding of this pivotal era deepens and shifts, inviting us to rethink long-held assumptions. Recent discoveries have broadened the geographic scope of research, revealing that the collapse was not confined to a handful of famous cities, but affected a vast region stretching from the Aegean to the Levant, and even beyond. Excavations in lesser-known sites uncover evidence of resilience as well as decline, suggesting a mosaic of experiences rather than a uniform disaster. One of the most transformative tools in recent decades has been archaeogenetics. By analyzing ancient DNA from human remains, scientists can trace population movements and interactions with remarkable precision. These studies have provided new clues about migrations during the collapse period, confirming the mixing of peoples and the arrival of new groups in certain regions. This genetic evidence complements archaeological finds and ancient texts, painting a more nuanced picture of shifting demographics. Advances in paleoenvironmental science have refined our understanding of climate's role. High-resolution data from ice cores, lake sediments, and stalagmites now reveal detailed patterns of drought and temperature fluctuations. These insights demonstrate that environmental stress was neither uniform nor simple, but fluctuated in intensity and duration, affecting different regions in varying ways. Such complexity challenges earlier views that emphasized a single catastrophic drought, instead showing a more dynamic interplay between nature and society. Remote sensing technologies, like satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, have revolutionized site detection and analysis. Archaeologists can now identify ancient settlements hidden beneath layers of earth or modern development, revealing new centers of habitation and trade. This expanded map of Bronze Age landscapes helps scholars understand the full extent of urban networks and how their collapse unfolded over time. Digital modeling and simulation have become valuable tools for testing theories about social and economic systems. Researchers use these models to explore how interconnected economies might respond to shocks such as trade disruption or resource scarcity. The results often support the system's collapse theory, showing how complex societies can reach tipping points where minor problems cascade into widespread failure. Furthermore, interdisciplinary collaboration enriches our perspective. Historians, archaeologists, climatologists, and anthropologists increasingly work together, combining data and methodologies to build a comprehensive narrative. This holistic approach acknowledges the intricate connections between human decisions, environmental changes, and external pressures. New findings also inspire fresh questions. For example, the evidence of continuity in some cultural practices during the collapse period suggests that the transition was not only about loss, but also about adaptation and innovation. Understanding how communities preserved traditions while adjusting to new realities helps us appreciate the resilience of ancient peoples. Ultimately, the ongoing research reminds us that history is a living story, continually rewritten as we uncover more pieces of the puzzle. Each discovery invites us to listen more closely to the voices of the past, guiding us toward a richer understanding of the Bronze Age collapse and, by extension, the cycles of change that shape human civilizations. As we come to the close of this long journey through the Bronze Age collapse, it is worth pausing to reflect on the profound transformations that unfolded during this time. The story we have traced is one not of sudden ruin alone, but of change, adaptation, and the enduring spirit of human communities facing extraordinary challenges. The collapse was shaped by a complex weave of forces: droughts that tested the land's fertility, earthquakes that shook cities to their foundations, invasions that disrupted established orders, and economic systems that unraveled under the strain of shifting alliances and broken trade routes. It was a world in flux, a moment when old certainties faded and new realities took root. Yet, amid the rubble of fallen palaces and silent marketplaces, life did not simply vanish. Smaller communities rose from the shadows of great cities, carving out new ways of living in a changed landscape. Traditions endured, even as social structures shifted, and the seeds of future cultures were planted in stories, passed down through generations. This period of transition reminds us that history is rarely a tale of pure destruction. Instead, it is a tapestry of continuity and change, loss and renewal. The challenges faced by these ancient peoples, environmental pressures, social upheaval, the clash of civilizations echo across the centuries, inviting us to consider the resilience required to navigate such times. Modern discoveries continue to deepen our understanding, revealing a world more interconnected and complex than once imagined. The Bronze Age collapse teaches us about the fragile balance sustaining civilizations, and the many threads that, when pulled, can reshape the course of history. As we drift toward sleep, let us carry with us this sense of timeless connection. Lives of those who came before, their struggles and triumphs, their hopes and fears. Their story is not just of an age-long past, but of the enduring human journey through change and uncertainty. May this reflection bring a calm closure to our exploration and gently ease us into restful dreams, cradled by the echoes of ancient voices and the quiet strength of history's unfolding.